Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, I rise tonight to talk about the extraordinarily challenging humanitarian situation in Gaza. And let's begin with October 7th. Mr. President, Israel has every right to eliminate the military threat of Hamas, to go after Hamas terrorists who conducted a horrific attack on Israel on October 7th. But how the Netanyahu government wages that war matters. And how they have done so is deeply disturbing to millions of Americans, and it's deeply disturbing to me. Hamas is the enemy. Palestinian civilians are not the enemy. Earlier this month, Senator Van Hollen and I visited the Rafah crossing on the border between Egypt and Gaza. We spoke with aid workers who had served in the worst conflict zones in the world, from Syria to Sudan to Yemen, including one worker who had spent several months working on the front line in Ukraine. Each told us that they had never witnessed a humanitarian disaster on the scale or severity of Gaza. In Gaza, calamity after calamity multiplies the suffering. It's not just a shortage of food. It's a shortage of food, it's contaminated water, it's massive displacement, it's continuous bombing and shelling, it's destroyed hospitals and other hospitals that desperately need drugs and medical supplies. It is communication failures due to damage and communication failures due to blackouts. As of today, more than 26,000 Palestinian civilians are dead. It is estimated that 70% are women and children, some 18,000 women and children. It's really an unfathomable number, but let's try to put some perspective on that. If 18,000 women and children were lined up holding hands, they'd form a line over 13 miles long. Or if you spent 1 minute with each child and woman, 18,000 women and children, it would take you more than 300 hours to visit or connect with each of them, 12 days. In addition to the 26,000 Palestinian civilians who are dead, an estimated 65,000 Palestinians are wounded. Of Gaza's 2.3 million people, 1.7 million are internally displaced. Over 70,000 homes destroyed. Those who were told to leave the north for the safety of the south are now often bombed or shelled in the locations they were encouraged to go to. There is no guaranteed safe place in Gaza. Even designated UN shelters have come under attack. We're thinking about food. 90% of Palestinians are living on less than one meal a day. Only one of the 3 clean drinking water pipelines from Israel is functioning. And water filtration equipment has been repeatedly turned away by Israeli inspectors, as I saw for myself in Rafah. Just 14 of 36 hospitals are still operating, and those hospitals lack basic medical supplies, and even lack food. One doctor who came out of Gaza talked to me about the extraordinarily deep wounds, burns caused by white phosphorus. And he showed me pictures of those wounds. Another talked to me about, he was an orthopedic surgeon. He fixed broken bones, but he said he couldn't believe how many bones had been shattered by the blasts and how much untreatable trauma there was to individuals' internal organs. UNICEF estimates that at least 1,000 children have had arms or legs amputated, many without anesthesia. New mothers have been profoundly impacted. More mothers are having miscarriages. More mothers are having stillbirths. More mothers are anemic and suffering postpartum hemorrhaging. More mothers are undernourished and cannot breastfeed, and yet finding clean water and formula is extremely difficult. More mothers are enduring C-section surgeries without anesthesia. Let me say it again. Israel has every right to go after Hamas. Hamas is Israel's enemy. The Palestinian people are not their enemy, and they are not our enemy. So we should be disconcerted. We should be staggered. We should be horrified by the extraordinary level of civilian deaths and injuries and the humanitarian challenges I've described with food and water and medicine. President Biden has called the bombing indiscriminate and urged the Netanyahu government to adopt a much more targeted war strategy. This message has been repeated by Secretary of State Blinken. This message has been repeated by Secretary of Defense Austin. These messages have been repeated with increasing intensity. But the Netanyahu government has rejected these requests. President Biden has called for Israel to vastly increase humanitarian aid to afflicted Palestinian civilians. But the Netanyahu government has also rejected that request. So the suffering is growing with each passing day. So what has prevented a massive influx of aid needed to address the humanitarian conditions in Gaza? Before October 7th, 500 trucks a day went into Gaza. Why can't 500 trucks a day go into Gaza carrying that needed humanitarian aid, food, water, and medical supplies? In short, Israel has done two things. They have set up a complex and inefficient inspection process post-October 7th that restricts aid from entering Gaza. And second, once aid is into Gaza, there isn't a deconfliction process that makes it possible to deliver aid safely. Into more detail now about how that inspection process works. Senator Van Hollen and I witnessed the burdensome inspection process firsthand at the Rafah checkpoint. The inspection process can take more than a week from the time a driver loads a truck until that driver can deliver that aid into Gaza. We witnessed hundreds of trucks lined up on the highway in Egypt, mile after mile of trucks. They were filled with food and water and medical supplies, sitting on the side of the highway. Now, some of them were waiting permission to go to Israel, to Nitzana, for inspection. And some of them had been inspected in Nitzana and sent back to Rafah to await final permission to enter into Gaza. The challenge, when you think about a truck, is it should be able to load up its supplies, be inspected, deliver the supplies in the same day, not a process that takes over a week. And let's think about that process for a moment. Israel is appropriately trying to stop dual-use items from entering into Gaza. And so there is a pre-approval process between the suppliers and the Israeli government. That's appropriate. But then when things are approved and trucks arrive at Nitzana, they're often told by the person inspecting, no, we're not allowing that to go in. Maybe the tent pole is too long. Or in one case, medical kits for birthing children had scalpels, and the scalpel's a sharp blade, and they were rejected. That inconsistently greatly complicates delivery. And it includes the fact that if anything in the load is rejected, the entire truck is rejected and starts the process all over again. Items that are allowed in one day can be rejected the next. Senator Van Hollen and I visited a warehouse full of those rejected items. And they were the things that you would expect for delivery for humanitarian aid. There were water testing kits, there were medical supplies, there was other desperately needed equipment. And once trucks make it through one of the two gates, Kerem Shalom from Israel, or Rafah crossing from Egypt, then they face the second problem, the problem of deconfliction, or the lack thereof of deconfliction. So the drivers face a terrifying gauntlet of damaged roads and falling bombs and artillery shells. The failure to set up deconfliction that allows this aid to be delivered safely is unacceptable. And there is only one government that can set up that deconfliction process, and that is the Netanyahu government. More than 150 UN workers have been killed in Gaza so far, the largest loss of life in the history of the United Nations. More than 300 additional healthcare workers have been killed. And due to injuries and displacement, the UN humanitarian workforce, which was 13,000 strong in Gaza on October 6th, has been reduced to 3,000 workers. The rest are injured or killed or refugees within Gaza itself. Only the Netanyahu government has the power to establish an organized, efficient inspection process. Only the Netanyahu government has the power to enforce deconfliction protocols. This double failure has stymied the delivery of sufficient humanitarian aid, unnecessarily deepening the suffering of Palestinian civilians. And now delivery of aid faces an additional problem. The Netanyahu government has produced information showing that at least 12 UN workers may have been involved in the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel. And this is, for sure, deeply troubling. That's 12 workers out of a workforce that counted 13,000. But it is troubling. It is completely against the principles in which the UN Relief and Works Agency functions. And the U.S. has appropriately paused assistance to UNRWA, pending an investigation. And I welcome that these individuals were immediately terminated. They certainly don't represent the thousands of men and women who work for UNRWA and bravely serve vulnerable people day in and day out in some of the most dangerous settings around the world. I look forward to a swift and thorough investigation to ensure accountability so that the U.S. assistance can promptly resume, that the entire humanitarian assistance program can continue. And wish though we might, there is no immediate way to replace that UNRWA workforce, now down to 3,000 workers, but essential 3,000 workers to deliver the aid that does make it into Gaza. It can't be replaced overnight by any other international organization. It is the Netanyahu government that has chosen a war strategy against Hamas that has killed a breathtaking, shocking, unacceptable number of Palestinian civilians. It's the Netanyahu government that has preserved a complicated and inefficient inspection system and a failed deconfliction process that severely limited humanitarian aid to innocent civilians. But let me be clear, the United States shares the responsibility for these failures. We, the United States of America, is Israel's major partner in supplying economic aid. We, the United States, are Israel's major partner in supplying military aid. We, the United States, have resupplied Israel with bombs and artillery shells of the types that have caused many of the civilian deaths. The world looks at our close partnership and expects the U.S. to do more than request that the Netanyahu government adopt a more targeted strategy against Hamas to reduce civilian deaths and injuries. The world expects the United States to do more than request that the Netanyahu government fix the inspection and deconfliction process to greatly increase the flow of humanitarian. No matter how often we request, no matter how intensely we request, simply requesting hasn't worked. The world expects the United States to use our influence that comes with being Israel's closest partner to reduce the civilian carnage and vastly increase the humanitarian aid. President Biden and his team have operated for 3.5 months under Plan A, and Plan A made sense in the context of a long-standing relationship. And Plan A was to make requests, Make them more clearly, make them repeatedly, make them more intently, but not use any other significant leverage for change. Plan A, now over 100 days in operation, has failed. So it's time that the United States move in a bolder fashion. Let's call it Plan B. Provision 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act reads, and I quote, "No assistance shall be furnished under this act or the Arms Export Control Act to any country when it is made known to the President of the United States that the government of such country prohibits or otherwise restricts directly or indirectly the transport or delivery of United States humanitarian assistance." Well, Senator Van Hollen and I certainly saw for ourselves the restrictions on the delivery of aid that the Netanyahu government has sustained for 100 days. A convoluted inspection policy and a broken deconfliction process. 620I is American law. It enables the President of the United States to tell Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, we are not allowed by law to provide another dollar of aid as long as you are restricting humanitarian aid into Gaza through these broken deconfliction process and complicated, convoluted inspection process. So President Biden has leverage. He's bound by American law. All he has to do is make it clear that that's leverage that he's bound to follow. That's a law he's bound to follow. As long as Netanyahu government restricts the delivery of humanitarian aid, the U.S. cannot legally deliver financial or military aid to Israel under Provision 620I of U.S. public law. And the President should do more. Our President should do more. He should make it clear that as long as the Netanyahu government delivers insufficient humanitarian aid to Gaza, the U.S. is going to provide aid directly. Directly provide food, water, medical aid to the Palestinian people in Gaza. It's time for the United States to use American ships and helicopters to provide medical supplies to every one of Gaza's remaining 14 hospitals. We must move swiftly to eliminate the shortages of anesthesia and antibiotics and any other shortfall of medicine or medical supplies. Picture American helicopters delivering to those 14 hospitals. Never again should a woman delivering a child in Gaza go through a C-section without anesthesia. Never again should a child having an arm or leg amputated because it's shattered or it's full of gangrene have it done without anesthesia. Never again should these medical procedures occur with antibiotics. The U.S. can deliver and is morally bound to address this shortfall of medical aid. It's also time for our team, our president, to say to Team Netanyahu, to say to his government, that if the Netanyahu government cannot or will not ensure that sufficient food and water are supplied to civilians in Gaza, the U.S. will ensure. And we will use our ships and our ship-to-shore assets to supply food and water to Gaza directly, which fortunately has a 40-mile coastline that greatly facilitates that type of supply. We, the United States, as the major partner with Israel through financial aid and military aid, are inextricably linked to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The U.S., as Israel's supplier, is complicit now in the suffering of the people in Gaza. This complicity must end. President Biden must use the leverage and power of the United States to address the suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, to deliver medical supplies, to deliver food, to deliver clean water. Let me step back and repaint this picture once again. More than 26,000 Palestinians are dead. That includes more than 18,000 women and children. More than 65,000 Palestinians have been injured. 1.7 million Palestinians in Gaza have been driven from their homes. 90% of Palestinians in Gaza are surviving on less than a meal per day. The supply of clean water is woefully insufficient. Medicines are in desperately short supply. As we ponder this, we must realize we must value the life of every child the same, no matter who they are or where they call home. If we keep that in mind, we will find the right answer to the enormous suffering in Gaza. The Palestinian people are not Israel's enemy. The Palestinian people are not America's enemy. The U.S. must end our complicity in this humanitarian catastrophe. The U.S. must pivot from simply requesting that the Netanyahu government fix the inspection and deconfliction processes that are restricting humanitarian aid, to using every asset at our disposal to directly deliver a massive amount of humanitarian aid into Gaza. We must act boldly, we must act swiftly. To do otherwise is completely unacceptable and immoral. The U.S. must act now.